younger rock. Each has its own flora, from tiny desert parsleys, Lomatium, the flower and disappear before May, to the northernmost reach of an entire plant family plastered against a sheer cliff, to meadows so crammed full of flowers they barely qualify as grassland. This is also a land in peril. Less than 10% of the grasslands and meadows remain, and much of what does is fighting an uphill battle with invasive organisms. This presentation will introduce the plants and habitats of far southeastern Washington and adjacent Idaho, including the Palouse, Snake River Canyon, and surrounding mountains. I ask you all to put your questions in the Q&A, which I will moderate at the end of the talk for Alex. And it is with great joy and pleasure I introduce Alex Wright to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Denise. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and talk to you all. The genesis of this talk was a couple years ago, actually, when Gail, that was the wrong button, when Gail talked to me at the Northwest Flower and Garden Show, and I was first considering coming back to Pullman. And now I'm here, and I've spent the last several months going around and snapping as many more photos as I can to shore up my library. But it's still not quite peak bloom here, so I want to extend a special thank you as well to Walter Fertig of the Washington Natural Heritage Program, who supplied me with a few more pictures of species that bloom later so that I wasn't able to photograph this year. So I want to start off tonight by talking about just where we are in the state of Washington. This is sort of a whole nother world for people who are based in Seattle, and it's worth getting a bearing of exactly where in the world we are. Then I'll delve into the human history of the area, the geological history going way back. Then I'll get to actually talking about the plants, the things you all came here to see. So we're here in the southeast corner of Washington, not quite down at the bottom. I'm sitting here in sunny Pullman, Washington, which houses Washington State University. We are just across the border from Moscow, Idaho, which houses the University of Idaho. We are just a little bit south of Spokane, and the major city in our area is Lewiston and Clarkston, which are twin cities straddling the border of Washington and Idaho. I also wanted to mark on here, most people know Walla Walla. Walla Walla has a similar flora along the western slope of the Blue Mountains, and also Clarkia, which you may have heard of, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So within this area, I'll refer to a few of these counties by name, but I'll try not to do that too much to avoid confusion. So we're sitting here in Whitman County, and just across the border is Latah County. And then we'll also talk a little bit about Asotin County and Nez Perce County. Also, an important benchmark to get our bearings here are the major rivers of the area. So you can just barely see the Columbia down here at Tri-Cities. The Snake runs across this area, going all the way down and where it comes out of Hell's Canyon, flowing into the Columbia. Joining the Snake at Lewiston and Clarkston is the Clearwater, which drains a large section of the mountains of northern Idaho. And flowing right through Pullman, which sits right about there, is the Palouse River here. And don't worry about all those colors. I'll explain those in a minute as well. So starting in with the humans, the first people to arrive in this area were the indigenous peoples. So to the north of us, we have the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene peoples who speak Salishan languages. And around here and towards the south, there are the Palouse and the Nez Perce peoples who speak closely related languages of the Plateau Panutian group. And to illustrate them here, I've included a photo of a very important food plant, which we know as Lomatium hausch, but it borrows that specific epithet from the Plateau Panutian languages. It's also worth recognizing that this area saw some of the bloodiest conquests and as part of the Euro-American expansion. And that is still in evidence in some areas. So I want to remind you of a longstanding controversy in this part of the world. This toponym of a watercourse commemorates a hanging after a battle. So the state of Washington has been trying for years to get this changed, but the federal government and the state of Idaho are not behind that idea at the current moment. So this is what the Palouse looks like today. And this is largely a product of the Euro-American settlement. So you notice that the only native vegetation in this photo is right up here on Steptoe Butte. Everything that you see around here is farmed. Primarily, this is wheat. We are here in Whitman County, the nation's #1 wheat producing county. But a lot of it is also in canola and garbanzo beans and lentils as well. The first real botanical exploration of this area was with the Lewis and Clark expedition. So here's a map of the Lewis and Clark expedition going across the continent of North America. And we're in this little box here. So here I've zoomed it in and replaced some of their names with modern names. So Pullman and Moscow sit right around here. The Palouse River here, the Potlatch River here, and Lewiston and Clarkston is sitting right there. So they didn't seem to get up very much into our area, but they did come right across the mountains and come down the Clearwater River and then down the Snake, right south of Pullman. Some of the plants they collected, this one actually is of very much importance to me. This is Berberis repens, or the creeping Oregon grape. This was actually collected by seed by Meriwether Lewis. He did not collect an actual specimen of it. So it's not entirely clear exactly where he got this thing, because it was described in England from material that had been sent to England from cultivated material in Philadelphia. And where it was collected matters a little bit, because the plants here, just south of Pullman, are a little bit different from those a little bit upstream of Lewiston. Another one that they collected was Syntheris mazurica, often now considered part of the genus Veronica, which was also the subject, after they had named it, of a particularly strange naming kerfuffle, where the name that was supposed to be applied to this species was actually applied to a species from the coast. And after a series of back and forth, it was settled on the name Mazurica for this species, commemorating the Missouri River on the other side of the Rockies. But jumping forward 100 years, this is the Marion-Ownby herbarium at Washington State University. And there have been a lot of illustrious names that have come through this herbarium. So some of the ones you might recognize: Charles Vancouver Piper was a very early professor of botany. He arrived here in 1892. And here on the left, you can see Anemonoides piperi, one of many, many plants named after Piper. Piper also produced a flora of southeastern Washington, which he then expanded with his successor Rolla Beatty into a flora of Washington and a flora of the Northwest coast. Harold St. John came afterwards as a professor of botany and also wrote a flora of southeastern Washington, which are very, very detailed books coming through the flora before it was almost all gone. Also, some more names you may recognize. We have some major early collectors who passed through this herbarium. We have Wilhelm Suchsdorf, who resided in Klickitat County. We have about 30,000 of his specimens here in Pullman. So you'll know Suchsdorf from many, many Suchsdorfii, and Cusick as well. William Cusick collected extensively in the Blue Mountains and surrounding areas. About half of his material came here to Pullman and half of it went and is now in Corvallis. And after those early collectors, there were so many other people here that I couldn't just go down a list, including the eponymous Marion-Ownby, who did seminal work on Calochortus and Allium and Tragopogon and so much else. And we're continuing that, not least myself, I hope. So this is me above the Snake River last spring, photographing the first time that I had seen Yabia, or Yabea probably more correctly, here in far eastern Washington. So now switching or jumping way back, we can talk about the drastically abridged geological history of this area. So the first major event here are the Columbia River basalt flows. So this happened in 17 million years ago. It really started going, and it kept going up until about 6 million years ago. So this covered central Washington and so much else of the Northwest. But one of the very interesting things that it did was because the mountains of northern Idaho were essentially in place at that time, the basalt flowed up those valleys and dammed them, forming a series of finger lakes, which I'll show you a bit more of in a little bit. After this, the ancestral Columbia and Clearwater flowed more or less in their current courses down towards the Columbia Gorge, but the Cascades started rising in earnest, and that impounded the Columbia and Clearwater to form a gigantic swamp in the vicinity of Yakima and Tri-Cities today. But as those Cascades got higher, that swamp dried out, and a series of major wind events carried a lot of that swamp sediment over to what we now know as the Palouse. Then, during the Ice Age, and I know people who know the Ice Ages are going to balk at this, this only shows the ice sheet, it does not show all the alpine glaciations. So 18,000 years ago, in the middle of the Ice Age, there was a major earth dam breach in what is today Great Salt Lake, but was then the gigantic Lake Bonneville. And all that water rushed out across southern Idaho, which is talked about a lot when you talk about the geology of southern Idaho. But we tend not to talk about it much in Washington, but it was a major force in deepening and widening the Snake River Canyon as it goes through our area here. Perhaps more talked about here in Washington are the Missoula floods, which happened a little bit later, but happened over and over and over again. So this little tongue of the continental ice sheet dammed the river here and caused a massive impoundment in western Montana called Lake Missoula, which then destroyed that ice dam over and over again and rushed down across central Washington, not only creating giant chasms in the basalt in central Washington, but also scraping away much of the wind-blown sediment. And we can read these events on the landscape today. So here we can see in the dark green some of the old mountains here and how they stick up from the central or from the Washington portion of the range here. These are granitic mountaintops that are sticking above the basalt and above that covering of windblown sediment. The most famous of these, and the one that gives its name to the geographic feature, is Steptoe Butte. So here's Steptoe Butte from the east, rising over the town of Palouse. And you can see it does just stick out like a sore thumb. So today we call these ancient mountaintops that are covered in younger rock, we call them steptoes. Here's another example, which is perhaps less celebrated, and it's not part of the National Natural Landmark, unfortunately. This is Granite Point, which is on the Snake River. So this was completely covered by basalt, but then the Snake River eroded the basalt enough that it uncovered this granite mountaintop. We can also see these silted in finger lakes. They're no longer lakes here because they're 15 million years old. They're completely silted in. Here's a view of one of them. They are, in some places, just Bowling Green flat. And this is where the town of Clarkia comes in, because these finger lakes had such a special chemical conditions in their water that they preserved things amazingly. So Clarkia lies on one of these old finger lakes, and it is a fossil site of worldwide importance because the preservation is just so good. You can pull DNA, you can see chlorophyll in these fossils. These finger lakes are really amazing treasures. And for this reason, not only because they have fossils in them, but because they used to be lakes but are no longer, I tend to refer to these as the fossil lakes, and they are also an important reservoir of modern flora. We can also see here the loess, the wind-deposited soil, the old swamp deposits from the Tri-Cities area. So here it is, just on the north edge of town here. A big chunk of basalt down here, still pretty flat, covered by meters and meters of wind-blown sediment. And we can also see, cutting through those Missoula flood channels. So it's a common misconception that the Palouse soil was deposited by the Missoula flood channels, but instead we can see here that actually cuts through our Palouse soils. So this is Mason Draw, just outside of the town of Winona. And you can see there's this big channel that was carved into the Palouse soils as the Missoula floodwaters rushed through. And as I turn around to look on the other side of the road, you can see that it carved out even more, and it left just these little islands of Palouse soil. And so you can see the water was flowing in this direction. And so we have this sharp nose on these little islands of soil. Of course, we also have the really spectacular things. This is Palouse Falls, which is one of the most scenic spots in Washington for my money. So do come out and see it if you haven't. It's flowing really well right now. So we've talked about the geology, but I think it's also very important to talk about the atmospheric conditions as well. So this is a map of average May rainfall. So one of the critical environmental constraints of this area is that we get a ton more rainfall in spring than central Washington does. Still not nearly as much as northern Idaho, but we get an appreciable amount more than the middle of the state. And this allows the plants to grow a lot larger and a lot thicker. Couple that with the deep soil, and you have a completely different vegetation here than you do in central Washington. And here's an image of one of those rain showers that passed through a couple weeks ago. One of the very first ones of the season here. And you can see that it's just this wave of dark clouds coming from the west to drop rain on us. So these are the general vegetation types. And I know that there are people who work on the vegetation out here who are going to be screaming at me, but I'm going to stick with this. So we can see out here in Montana and Idaho, the forests in this dark green, which extend out on these basalt, or these granite hilltops all the way into the Palouse. Also in Idaho, we have this orange color, which is a phenomenal botanical wonderland of Idaho river canyons, which just have that perfect combination of heat and moisture to get some really amazing stuff growing in them, which I do not have time to talk about today. But just take my word for it for now that they are second to none amazing. We have the fossil lakes here, these dammed up finger lakes, which are more prevalent up here. That's slightly different formation or cause down here in the Wayette Prairie area. And then down here, the Blues and the Blue Mountains here and Craig Mountain here in Idaho are constructed of basalt, but they're uplifted to form mountains instead of the flat basalt in central Washington and the Palouse. Then the crux of this is the prairie here. So I divided it here into short grass and tall grass, which is not a distinction that we actually use, but it's one that I find very useful to talk about with people who have not been out here or who are not deeply steeped in this area. Because the Palouse around Pullman is about as close to the tall grass prairie as you can get under a summer dry rainfall regime. So, well, and much like the tall grass prairie of the Midwest, this area is highly disturbed and very little of it is left. So this is a classic Palouse landscape. You can see a few of these granite hilltops here, but mostly it's these large rolling hills of loess soil. And then the canyon just south of Pullman, oh, sorry, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. And then cut into these hills are these shallow river channels, which expose a little bit of basalt on the side, but they're not deep canyons. And then on the north-facing slopes, the taller slopes in these river valleys often support large groves of conifers, primarily ponderosa pine, but also Douglas fir and sometimes grand fir, which the north sides of the hills are often too short to support. This is the Snake River Canyon, which is a 1,500-foot deep gouge that the Snake River has carved down or through the middle of this basaltic landscape. And you can see that just on the outside of the canyon, the land is almost totally flat, which to my mind makes this a little bit more exciting than Hell's Canyon, where Hell's Canyon is a jumble of basalt in all directions going from the bottom of the river up to the top of the mountains. Here we have a canyon that is almost entirely hidden, something that just appears out as soon as you start to descend into it. And this Palouse Canyon dichotomy does have some interesting effects. So we do get these species pairs. These are not always sister species, so they're not always each other's closest relatives, but frequently we will find two closely related species, one of which we find up on the Palouse or the granite hilltops in the Palouse, and then one we find down in the basalt of the canyon. So here we have two Selaginella species. On the left, we have Selaginella wallacei, which is, here it's growing on granite down the bottom of the canyon, but it grows on all different rock types down in the desert there. And then on the right, we have Selaginella densa, which is the species that is found up here on the Palouse on granite hilltops. We have this species pair, although to be quite honest, I'm getting less and less convinced of this one, because we have in the canyon Astragalus riparius, and then on the right, up around Pullman, we have Astragalus, oh darn it, it's covered by the thing. I'm getting a little bit less, erectus, sorry, Astragalus erectus. I'm getting a little bit less convinced of this one, in part because many of our plants around Pullman have stipitate pods, which is supposed to be restricted to the canyon plants. We also have this, which nominally there's both Lomatium multifidum, which is one of the most gratifyingly scented desert parsleys out this way. But on the left are plants from the canyon, which grow specifically in and around rock slides, and they have these very narrow and long leaf segments. And then up on the Palouse, we have these with these very, very fine leaf segments, and they grow primarily in deep soil. As far as I know, this has not been examined yet. And then we have this, which is, or at least was at one time, one of the more celebrated examples of speciation down in the canyon here. So on the right, we have plain old whitebark raspberry, or what approximates plain old whitebark raspberry in our mountains here, with a whitish underside to the leaf. But on the left, we have Rubus nigerimus, which is an extension of this species group into the canyon. It's found in our part of the Snake River Canyon, as well as up the Grand Ronde River. And it completely lacks that powdery coating on the bottom of the leaf. So I want to take a moment and place the Palouse in context, because we talk about a couple of different things. We talk about Palouse prairie, we talk about Palouse soil. In general, when we use the word Palouse, we're referring to either that soil formation or the things that grow on that soil formation. So Palouse refers to this landscape here, but this is part of a larger system of moist-ish meadows that fringe the Northern Rockies in this area. Almost nothing is restricted to the Palouse proper, but this area still has many, many special plants. They're just found in the other meadowy areas as well, not just these rolling hills. So one of the most emblematic plants of the Palouse, to my mind, is this little Trillium petiolatum, which looks for all the world like cabbages growing out of a wet meadow here. And it bears its flowers right at ground level, and they do not smell good. But here's its distribution. To remind you, Pullman is right around here. So the Palouse proper is stretching roughly from Spokane down to the Snake River here. But this plant is found in a whole bunch more areas. This distribution is fairly typical, if a little bit larger than, it's fairly typical of, but a little bit larger than many of our special Palouse plants. They also couldn't talk about the Palouse without talking about some of the problems that are facing it. So according to Duffin in 2007, and I have the full reference for that for you at the end of the presentation, 94% of this area has been converted to agriculture. And because so much of that was done so early on, a lot of that agriculture was not done with erosion control in mind. So this area also experiences some of the greatest erosion rates in the nation. And much of what's left is very, very degraded by weeds and by grazing, especially in the canyon. There's a lot more grazing in the canyon. So out here, you will frequently find, even in relatively natural patches of habitat, many weedy annual grasses, which can drastically increase the frequency of fire, especially in place, and which can be very deleterious to some of these native plants, which are not used to fire of that frequency. You'll frequently find weedy perennial grasses running through natural areas, which start smothering all the little perennials that are native to the prairie. And you'll also find a bunch of weedy trees, some of which shade out the native vegetation. So I'll go back to this picture, and I'll note again that this is a huge swath of landscape that you can see here. And, well, apart from that little top of a Douglas fir at the bottom, the only native vegetation you can see is on Steptoe Butte. Everything else has been converted to agriculture or to towns. This is a fairly decent microcosm of the Palouse here. And it also shows you where you might find some of these native habitats. So there is native habitat in this photo, but it's just this little patch right here, barring, of course, you can kind of see the top of Kamiak Butte sticking out the back there. But most of this is either converted to agriculture, or in the foreground, we have in the drier areas, Bromus inermis, or smooth brome, which is a very, very dense growing rhizomatous grass, which physically smothers a lot of prairie plants. And then on the right, we have Phalaris arundinacea, our common old reed canary grass, which does the same thing for wetland plants. Speaking of the erosion, there have been many efforts, many of them led by Washington State University, to reduce erosion on the Palouse. But still, every winter, the Palouse River runs brown. And you can also see on the right there that it's severely undercutting the bank because the valley bottom vegetation is also completely gone. This is what the valley bottom vegetation is more or less supposed to look like. The herb layer isn't quite right because this area is grazed, but you can see that this flat valley bottom is covered in hawthorn scrub with a few ponderosa pine sticking up through it. And even in these native areas, or relatively native areas, so this is a preserve that was once managed by the Nature Conservancy, but is now managed by the Palouse Clearwater Environmental Institute. This is Rose Creek Preserve north of Pullman. This top part of the prairie not only abuts a wheat field, but has a complete coverage of this weedy grass, Medusa's head, or Teniatherium capitmedicae, just going throughout the native vegetation here. Something that's exploded in population here on the Palouse in the past several years is wiregrass, Ventinata dubia, which was previously spotty but just in the last 10 years it's on every road cut. It's in almost every prairie bit. Our classic weedy grass here is cheatgrass, which is, you'll find it on the Palouse, but it is everywhere down the canyon. Here you can see a large area which is almost entirely covered by cheatgrass. And these large bunch grasses aren't our native bunch grasses. That's another weed, that's Thinopyrum intermedium, another weedy grass that is taking over native habitat. Other weedy plants in the canyon, you can see here in this large area of just fairly homogeneous vegetation, this is primarily cheatgrass and yellow star thistle and woolly vetch. And then if I turn around and look up the other side of that draw, it's an almost solid cover of bulbous bluegrass. So this is a typical scene you will see right about now in the canyon. But it's important to point out that we have all of these environmental stressors and conversions going on here. So you can see down in the foreground, all that water is the Snake River, but this part of the Snake is impounded. This is Lower Granite Lake. So that's land conversion, which has completely destroyed most of the riparian forest and the camas prairie that existed along the river. You can see up at the top of the hills that the vegetation looks fairly fuzzy and homogeneous. It's not supposed to look like that. Whenever you see really homogeneous, fuzzy looking vegetation in the canyon here, that's almost entirely weeds. And then it's somewhat hard to see, but you can somewhat see it right here. You can see a bunch of cow trails. So the cows are going through and eating all the native shrubs and introducing weed seeds by the thousands. And here are a couple of the weeds that you'll find. So this one actually shows up way up the side canyons, pretty much everywhere that's warm enough to support it. This is Prunus mahalib, or St. Lucia cherry, which is, it's almost funny to find it in the wild because it's widely known in horticulture for having very nicely scented flowers, but where it tends to grow in the wild, it tends to grow in amongst our native hawthorn, which has very, very bad scented flowers. And the combination somehow makes everything that much worse. We also have some surprising trees that have shown up as weeds. So these are all growing in riparian areas along the Snake River. We have walnuts, and we have ashes, and we have maples. We also, growing right along the river, have an almost continuous band of false indigo, which is one of a few riparian things from Eastern North America, which have become very common and displaced most of the riparian vegetation right along the lakeshore in our stretch of the Snake River. Box elder is a very common tree throughout most of the West, but it's not native here. And it's become one of our most common weed trees. Here it is at the top of a draw leading down to the Snake, but you'll also find extensive patches of it up here on the Palouse. Some of these trees seem to be mostly okay for the understory. So here is Prunus avium, or the wild cherry. And you can see that the understory here is pretty much what it's supposed to be. There's a bunch of different perennials there. It's a pretty good native understory. But contrast that with something like this, Prunus spinosa, which is another European cherry. This one is actually used to flavor gin. So if you've seen sloe gin, this is the fruit that is used to produce that flavor. But the shade here or the water relationship of the roots is so strangling that there's almost nothing that can grow underneath it. About the only thing that does grow really well underneath a thicket of sloe is this orchid, this native orchid. But sloe is slowly spreading across the Palouse, and it's exterminating pretty much everything underneath it as it goes. So, but this is not all doom and gloom. Some of these weeds are actually kind of fun to find. You find little weeds here that aren't found pretty much anywhere else in the US. So this is Astragalus falcatus. This is a Russian milk vetch that it's not very common. You'll see it every occasionally, but this was an agricultural contaminant that it just sort of pops up here and there. And then this was a real surprise to me. These are foxtail lilies, native of Central Asia, which showed up on the side of a mountain road north of Pullman. So that's enough of the weeds. So let's get into some of the native plants that we all came here to see. So I'm going to tackle a lot of the stuff that's way up in the mountains as quickly as I can, because as much as I'd love to delve into it, I don't have time to really get into all this. So like I said, Idaho is sort of a botanical wonderland with all sorts of interesting and ridiculously amazing stuff. Here are a few things. So Corydalus caesana subspecies hestata, which is a form of fitweed. It is found in wet areas in the mountains. It's a gigantic bleeding heart relative. It frequently gets 6 feet tall. And then Cardamine constantii is a relative of shotweeds with wonderfully fragrant flowers that grows on river benches down right along the Clearwater and some of the other rivers around here as well. And its closest relatives are found not in Western North America, but in far eastern North America and Europe. Also in Idaho, this is only found in a few of the fossil lakes, is this tall phlox, unlike any other phlox we have in the Western US. And on the ridges, we have this monotypic genus, which is only found on 10 miles of ridgeline in Idaho. But once you get there, it is everywhere. And you find some other really surprising things. So northern Idaho and one spot in northeastern Oregon are the only places that this hybrid has been recorded in the wild. This is a hybrid of serviceberry and mountain ash, which you can kind of see it from this photo. It has larger flowers and kind of the wrong arrangement, but you can also see here it does produce a few little extra lobes on the leaf, and the berry, or the fruits rather, are red instead of the expected blue for a serviceberry. So now let's go down to the canyon, and then we'll work our way up to the Palouse. So way down the canyon, this is probably as good an introductory view as any. This is from the top of the Lewiston grade, which is one of the few highways that attempts to go down from the plateau up here, 1,500 feet down to the bottom of the canyon. So in this photo, you can see Lewiston and Clarkston. Lewiston is on this side of the Snake River, and here the Clarkston is here on this side of the Snake River. Lewiston, right along there, is the lowest point in Idaho, just over 700 feet elevation. This is also the meeting of the Snake and the Clearwater rivers, and you can actually see Hell's Canyon with the Snake emanating from it right down the middle. On the right, you can see the Blue Mountains of Washington, which is, as I said, that uplifted basalt. And the corollary mountains on the left is Craig Mountain in Idaho, which is also botanical wonderland, but that is another whole can of worms. So one of the species that you'll see most often down here in the Snake Canyon is Artemisia rigida, which is a very interesting little sagebrush. It's almost fully deciduous, and it's just about in full leaf right now. And its bailiwick, excuse me, are these basalt rim rock that are stacked up and down the canyon. But there are also trees down the canyon as well. So this is one of the most common. This is our native hackberry, Calvus levigata. And you can see its female flowers on the left there. I actually didn't realize it when I had photographed it, but you'll frequently see this plant deformed by gall-forming insects. So you can actually see up here, those little brown flecks are leaves that are held on by a psyllid gall that attacks the petiole of the leaf. And here I actually caught one of those psyllid bugs. Didn't realize it at the time, otherwise I would have put it in a jar, but there's one of those psyllid bugs in the flesh. The other most common tree down there is the white alder, which can form large stands in some of the larger side canyons. But you'll note here, so this is another view of that same canyon with the white alder. These light yellowish green trees are hackberries. These darker ones are alders. But in between them is an almost solid carpet of blackberry, which has all but choked out the native understory vegetation in this particular side canyon. There are a few that have native vegetation in the side canyons left, or woodland vegetation in the side canyons left, but there is almost none that's still around. Here's a view of the canyon itself. This is from just a little bit higher. So you can see some of this layer cake effect of the basalt. All of the basalt you can see here, not that little bit up there, but this major chunk here, that's all Grand Ronde basalt. So one set of basalt flows out of that huge period of basalt emanating out from northeastern Oregon, southeastern Washington. You can also see here that there's a bunch of little caves along the hillside here underneath this large flow of basalt. Those have actually been inhabited for thousands and thousands of years, and there are archaeological sites that are littered throughout the canyon. Those caves are also very interesting because this area is so low in elevation, and it has such it reflects so much, or it re-radiates so much heat from its black basalt rock, that some of those overhangs remain frost-free throughout winter. So this is a little monkey flower, which grows crammed up into these crevices where there's a little bit of water flowing through. And here it is blooming in January. On top of the basalt, you'll frequently find Idahoa, which is the very cute little mustard that has these impossibly tiny flowers, and then these purse-shaped capsules with these large, with the seeds with a large wing around them, which are almost entirely in seed by now, if they haven't completely died down for the summer. You'll frequently find these flowering at the end of February, beginning of March. Lomatium salmoniflorum blooms very closely after that. This is one of the special lomatiums of the Snake River Canyon that is not found in that many other places in the world. It's frequently confused with the very common Lomatium papillioniferum, which I'll show a bit later. But Lomatium salmoniflorum, fairly restricted range, but in the right place around here, you can find a lot of it. This is right near a popular park in the canyon here, with thousands of Lomatium salmoniflorum stretched along the railroad tracks here. Also, down the canyon, we have just about the driest places that you can find Dutchman's breeches. This was Dicentra cucullaria, which is primarily distributed in the eastern US, but has a secondary distribution which is centered on northern Idaho, and it goes and bleeds through the Blue Mountains. And you also find it in moist spots in the Columbia Gorge, all the way out to the Oregon coast. But here, you find very large plants, which are growing underneath these remnant canyon riparian woodlands. And we've got all sorts. We've got white ones, pink ones, ones that climb on rocks, and they all seem to vary in subtle ways, but significant. So here are two that were growing right next to each other. And you can see that not only do they vary in pinkness, but they vary in the shape of the horns here. They vary in the placement of these two little bracts, which here are right up close to the flower and here are well away from it. Down the canyon, we also have this microspecies of of serviceberry, which is primarily distinguished by having a glabrous ovary, but I figured that wouldn't be an exciting photo for you. This one you won't find in many floras, but it is fairly distinctive in the canyon down here. There's also a surprising diversity of saxifrages down in the canyon. So, very early in the year, you'll find Micranthes nidifica on the left, which in some places seems to grade almost imperceptibly into Micranthes apetala, a very, very similar species, which I've had long arguments about. In the middle, on north-facing slopes, but not necessarily moist ones, there's Micranthes idahoensis, with toothed leaves and slightly whiter flowers, but not appreciably larger. And on the right, there's Micranthes frigosa, which blooms later than any of them, and has much larger flowers. That one should be wrapping up right around now. Also down in the canyon, there are a couple of really phenomenal flowering shrubs. There's golden currant, which to be fair has a much wider distribution, and is starting to bloom even up here in Pullman. But there's also snow currant, Ribes niveum, in the canyon, very commonly, which is an interesting plant to identify because you'll frequently hear it before you see it, because it has so many bees buzzing around these flowers. Which is also very perplexing because I've gone back to try and collect seed off of snow currant, and invariably the fruit is empty and no seed has been set. So I don't quite know what's going on there. This is one of my favorite finds over the last few years. This is Yabia microcarpa, which is a tiny little parsley relative. It's primarily found in California and distributed inconsistently all the way up to Victoria, BC. But then it also is distributed through the Columbia Gorge and then stops right around here in far eastern Washington and northern Idaho. So here it is in full flower. And because I love it so much, I'm going to inflict multiple pictures of it on you without your consent. So here it is right as it's germinating, and then another view of the plant in flower. And then just recently, I took some photos of it in seed, which with these just impossibly cute little fruits with these beautifully evil little sticky hairs that are reaching out to grab you. Another important find that I've run across down the canyon is Nemophila kirtley, which is distributed primarily in Hell's Canyon, but was collected in the Snake River Canyon just outside of Pullman by every single botany class field trip up until about 1970. And then after 1970, it was not collected again until I found it last year. And even then, I suppose it wasn't collected because I only found about 5 plants, and I decided that wasn't enough to press one. So this is now known from 2 sites in Washington as of last week. The second site has rather more plants in that it has about 10. So this is one to keep your eye out for if you ever come and tromp out around the Snake River Canyon. This plant, Glossopetalon spinescens, is also called grease bush, for why I do not know. This is the northernmost plant, or rather the northernmost population of the entire family Crossosomotaceae, which is just finishing blooming right now. This is not the northernmost plant, but it's about a mile from the northernmost plant, which I spent the winter slowly working my way southward to find the northernmost plant, and I can see it, but I haven't visited it yet. So here it is, growing right on a sheer basalt cliff overlooking the water. Interestingly, this species is fairly widely distributed in the Great Basin, but in most of the Great Basin, it grows preferentially on limestone and sandstone. But here in the Snake River Canyon, it grows exclusively on basalt. The only other place that I know of that it strays consistently off of limestone and sandstone is in the Trinity Mountains of California, where it grows on serpentine. Starting to bloom down there right now is Astragalus inflexus, one of the prettiest little milk vetches that we have to offer, which is, this wasn't a great photo, so I had to stick another one in there, looking straight onto the flower. Also blooming right now, Tritolaea grandiflora, which is found widely in the Columbia Basin, but it was so nice I had to include it. This one is one of the most common plants down in the canyon, but most of them don't flower. So you'll find this plant extremely commonly as its grassy vegetative leaves throughout the winter and early spring, but only some of them in the best spots will actually put out their flowers right now. And here it is in amongst the balsam root on one of the few patches of really, really good canyon grassland down along the Snake. This is one of our specialties out here. This is one of only 2 species in the genus Tonella. The other species is a tiny little thing that grows in California and the Columbia Gorge and all the way up through the San Juans and southwestern BC. But Tonella floribunda is quite large, can be over a foot tall. Each flower pushes a 1/4 inch across. It can be quite the sight. There are certain places which were unfortunately not quite in bloom when I visited them recently, where this plant covers an entire hillside and it just shimmers with light blue. Also down in those same habitats, you'll find Sedum Liburgii, which you'll find occasionally farther west in the basin. It has these long vegetative leaves which sprout relatively early in winter, but which wither almost entirely by the time it flowers. And this is just starting to come into flower now. Also just starting to flower is Scutellaria, this cute little skullcap, or the perhaps better called the blue squidward flower, which grows in the most impossibly baking hot rock slides. But those rock slides have a secret in that rock slides have a very cool and moist understructure because water condenses on the rocks that are buried and which never heat up because they never see the sun. So this seems to be taking advantage of that moisture underground, and it can tolerate the heat above ground here. A few sedges, because I had to throw in some things that were not pretty flowers. These are actually fairly common in seeps alongside the Snake River. So on the left, we have Carex aurea, which is sort of somewhat unusual because where I've seen this otherwise, it's usually in mountain bogs. But here it is growing on the south-facing basalt cliff. And on the right, we have Carex hystricina, which, yes, I am correcting that name. There's an argument to be made to not spell it that way, but you can take that up with me later. This is a rather attractive little sedge. It spreads widely, but it has these large, spiky spikelets. And growing with these sedges are huge patches of this native orchid, Epipactis gigantea, which is just barely not quite blooming right now. It's setting buds and the buds are swelling, but I couldn't find a single one open yesterday. Of course, the other plant that you'll find every single time you go down the canyon is poison ivy. And it is everywhere. It's especially everywhere where you want to go. But it has its good sides as well. You can see on the right, it's white berries which persist all through the winter, which we could potentially start a rehabilitation program to rename this plant Christmas berry instead of poison ivy. And blooming soon will be penstemon deuce, just the hot rock penstemon, along with some other penstemons that are special to the canyon, but for which I had no good photos. And also flying right now down the canyon is this particular kind of black swallowtail, Papilio indra, which I'm pretty sure is just waiting for these flowers to open because they seem to really love them. So now moving up out of the canyon onto a different rock type, I want to talk about a few plants that are growing on the outer extremities of the granite mountains because they sometimes bleed down at the Palouse Prairie, but aren't really indicative of it. So since I've been talking about multiple different astragalus, I should talk about Astragalus canadensis, which is completely different from what we usually think of as an astragalus. So most milk vetches we think of as these low things or these sometimes rather large things that grow in dry places and bright sunny spots in the middle of the Columbia Basin. But this grows in mesic forests on the north sides of mountains. And it's a passably attractive little plant, perhaps not as colorful as Astragalus inflexus, but certainly a delight to find when hiking these mountains. Something that requires a little bit more eye strain to see. This is Lomatium linearifolium, or prior it was called Orogenia linearifolia, a tiny little desert parsley which grows on the tops of the granite mountains here. This is distributed more frequently as you go farther south into Oregon and Idaho, but it barely gets into Washington. This is perhaps one of the northernmost spots just north of town here. And you can see it has these curious fruits, which are quite plump compared to most lomatiums. This thing essentially never gets taller than an inch. It remains pressed down against the soil even when there's no snow to keep it pressed there. This is a fun little plant, which is fairly widely distributed in the mountains here. This is Ozomelus, or Mitella stauropetala. And it has an interesting thing going on with it. So on the right and in the middle towards the bottom is the usual form that you'll find out here, which has white flowers. On the far right, you can actually see it in cultivation in my mom's garden. And these white flowers, they have a very slight floral, like boilerplate floral scent. And the petals here, see, so these are the petals, and then these are the sepals. the petals are divided into three. They have three long lobes. But in certain places around Pullman and Moscow, you can find this form, which has pink petals and pink sepals. And instead of having a faint scent of it has a particularly strong scent of watermelon Jolly Ranchers. As I have not been able to see if there's any difference in pollinators yet, but I would assume there might be. Another plant you'll find in the colder parts of the mountains here is Coptis occidentalis, which is part of a species complex which includes plants from the Western Cascades and the coast. And this plant is almost done blooming near Moscow. It's still blooming way up in the mountains, but it's almost done in the lower mountains. It has these beautiful evergreen leaves and these impossibly diaphanous stars for flowers, which come up very, very early. One of my favorite plants from the lower mountains here is Frasera fastigata, which carries in some places the impossibly dumb common name of the blue green gentian. Whatever you call it, it has these beautiful blue thyrses which wave in the wind in the meadows here. And you can find this growing in open forests. Sometimes you'll find it on some of the colder spots of Palouse Prairie. And then you can also see it growing, as here where I cheated a little bit on the right, growing high of about 6,000 feet on mountain ridges. And this plant grows quite large. It can frequently get 4 to 6 feet tall. And unlike Frasera speciosa, the very iconic monument plant of the Central Rockies, this plant is totally perennial. And you can revisit the same one year after year. So now, moving downslope just a little bit, back to the heart of the Palouse Prairie, around Pullman and a little bit northward. So we have a few major habitat types here on the Palouse Prairie. This is perhaps one of the more classical ones, where you have essentially just wall-to-wall flowers. At this moment, when this photo was taken, it's primarily balsam root and Lomatium here. This is Lomatium multifidum again. This is a little bit before the pink wave comes in mid-May. But also, excuse me, we have on north-facing slopes a bunch of hawthorn thickets. And another thing that you'll notice here, well, you'll notice two things. One is that on the far right, there's a white flowering tree. That's one of those Eurasian cherries. But also, what's left here of native vegetation is on a steep north-facing slope. You'll see up above and down below on the right, all of the area that's flat enough to plow has been plowed. So this is where you'll frequently find little snippets of native vegetation left on the Palouse Prairie, is places that were just too steep or too rocky to cultivate. These are the two species that primarily form these thickets. They're mostly hawthorn, but frequently you will also find groves of aspen interspersed with them. And here's what the understory looks underneath them. It's a little brushy, but you can see that there's a whole bunch of really large herbs growing underneath there. This, however, is what you usually see when you visit really moist areas in the Palouse. This is in the middle of town here, and this is very, very standard for what you see here, which is not a single native plant in this entire picture. The entire creek bottom is covered in reed canary grass. The trees here are white willow or crack willow, Salix alba vitellina, which is a European import. And there's a little bit on the left, that brownish bit is a bunch of tansy. So essentially, we don't have wetlands anymore. There are a few bits of wet meadow left, but almost none. And for some of that, and because all of our wetlands have gone, we've lost a lot of species as well. So this is a type of sea holly, Eryngium articulatum, which was found previously fairly widely across the Palouse here, found in Idaho and up to Spokane. And it's still found in Northern California and far southwestern Oregon. But out here on the Palouse, it hasn't been found for over 100 years. And based on the state of our wetlands, I seriously doubt if there's any left here. Here's another one. This is a very attractive clover. It's rather tall, actually. It's well over a foot tall usually, with these big pink heads. And it's still found if you go way up in the mountains into the Blues or into northern Idaho. But it was last seen on the Palouse in 1959. This is another one. This still grows in fair abundance on those fossil lakes up in Idaho. But out here on the Palouse, hasn't been found for over 100 years again. But things that we do still have here. Lomatium gourmanii, this is a very, very early blooming desert parsley. I found it in bloom, I think the earliest I've gotten it in town here in Pullman is January 16th. It's almost all in fruit by now, even here in Pullman. You can see the fruits ripening on the right. This is fairly generally distributed on steep or exposed basalt throughout the region here. And here it is growing right in the middle of town. You can actually see downtown Pullman on the left. And it's still growing in fair abundance, sandwiched between a road on top and the railroad tracks down below. Another very early bloomer here is the sagebrush buttercup, which is fairly common throughout the Columbia Basin. But it's quite abundant out here. Really seems to like the moisture we have in our hills. This is one of the true delights of this area, to see grass widows growing so thickly, the ground shimmers purple. So out here we have a slightly different one than is found in the Columbia Gorge and along the base of the Cascades. Ours is technically distinguished by having the filaments of the stamens, they're a little bit inflated right around the ovary. But you can also tell them because ours have a little bit paler flowers. And instead of growing primarily in exposed rocky sites, ours really like to grow in wet meadows. So here it is in a vernally wet depression just across the border in Idaho. And you can see that they're growing by the hundreds in this small depression, but very few on the surrounding uplands. Sometimes you also find white ones. Although this picture, I shouldn't dwell on it too much because I interrupted something private between those two beetles. Soon after the grass widows come the spring beauty on the left and this beautiful fritillary, beautiful but still quite smelly fritillary. And then comes one of the things which is almost only found on the Palouse and the related grasslands out here. This is Veronica rubra, or some might prefer the old name Cynthris rubra, which is completely apetalous. It has no petals here. All the color that you see are these brilliant red sepals, but also these electric purple filaments there. And this is just in full bloom right now. Also starting to come off peak bloom are the glacier lilies. We have just fields and fields of glacier lilies here. Usually they like a little bit of cover as the summer wears on, but you do find just scads of them. And the ones around Pullman, like several populations in the Rocky Mountains, but unlike most of the rest of Washington, have red anthers and red pollen. Ours also seem to bug out a little bit more when they flower. Perhaps they're just extra happy to be alive. And so the outer stamens reflex a lot. And they form really extensive patches. This is just on the north end of town here, underneath a grove of chokecherries. And another view because I couldn't resist. And if you go just a little bit farther north here, you'll find this cute little thing. This is Erythronium idahoense. It's part of the Erythronium grandiflorum species complex, but it has different color pollen, different color anther, and the tepals are also just the most ethereal white. And they eventually they'll slowly fade to just barely pink. This was photographed right on the northern boundary of Whitman County, right before it turns into Spokane County. A little after that, we have a few more flowers that come on. So right about now, you'll find delphinium starting to bloom. The bluebells in the center are also in full bloom right now. And then just starting to come into their own, especially on the in the wetter areas where they really form in large mats, are these shooting stars, which are one of the nicest scented things on the Palouse Prairie. Also underneath the hawthorn thickets, right about now, you'll find hydrophyllum. There's a really large white flowered species, but then there's also this little one, which grows in slightly drier places underneath the shade. But this is ballhead waterleaf with these light purple heads of flowers. Also blooming right now are violets. In some places, you'll find yellow violets as well on the prairie, but primarily you find a very cute, svelte little tiny form of Viola adunca, the common early blue violet. And in not too long, there will be cat's ears, which are related to the Mariposa lilies. This is Calochortus elegans, which has been divided up into subspecies before, but it really doesn't bear it out. So nominally, we're supposed to have a totally different one that grows way up in the, or a different subspecies that grows way up in the mountains, as well as down in the canyon. Well, the one on the bottom here, this was taken just outside of Pullman. And then on the left is at about 6,200 feet in the mountains between the Clearwater and St. Joe rivers. And you can see that they're relatively similar. The one that's really different and weird is on the top right, but instead of being jammed up somewhere deep in the mountains, that was from the north side of a granite hill overlooking the Palouse. So there's quite a bit of variation here, but it doesn't necessarily parse to what has been previously established for this species. One of the most emblematic, I suppose, species of the Palouse is Phlox longifolia. This is a shrubby phlox. It gets about a foot, 2 feet high. It's in full bloom down the bottom of the canyon right now, and it'll come into bloom around in Pullman in just a little bit. But this can be one of the dominant species in Palouse Prairie, so you will occasionally see large mats of pink, and it's almost all this species. Another one of my favorite plants, and actually these photos I just took this evening because I decided I liked these better than the one I had previously. These are sugar bowls, which is one of our two native, or I suppose 3 native clematis species in this area. But this one doesn't vine. It's a little clumping perennial that grows right smack in the middle of the prairie. And it has these most amazingly colored purplish, royal purple flowers. What you see here, these are actually the sepals. This plant does not have petals. Perhaps this one didn't merit an entire slide to itself, but I thought it's a rather cute, svelte little plant. This is Antonaria lusioloides. As pussy toes go, it's rather tall. It's bent over now, but it'll get about a foot tall once it starts to come into full flower. A few more plants, a bunch of yellows. The prairie will go into a yellow phase very soon before it enters its pink phase. So on the left, we have Hieracium schooleri variety albertinum, which is separated out as a variety since it is the fuzziest, wuzziest of all the Hieracium schooleris around. In the middle, there's Lithospermum ruderale, which is what we call puccoon out here. It's called puccoon because it's related, at least, to plants that were used for dyeing purposes. But it's also a pollinator favorite. And you can spend hours just watching all the different kinds of bees that come to this plant. And then on the right, just starting to bloom right now, is Senecio variety exaltatus, which is a nice butter yellow groundsel, which is fairly common throughout the prairie. Then we have a diversity of lomatiums in addition to the ones that I showed earlier. So on the right, we have the common Lomatium papillioniferum, which is what used to be lumped into a very broad concept of Lomatium grayi. In the middle, there's Lomatium tritornatum, and I think this is the real tritornatum. You have to ask someone who knows Lomatiums better than I do to know about that. And then on the left is Lomatium macrocarpum. Lomatium macrocarpum is the standard botanical prank for anyone who's new to this area. So if you come out here and we go out in the field together, I will try and get you to smell Lomatium macrocarpum. Please humor me, even though you know it is going to be the nastiest flower you've ever smelled. Lomatium papillioniferum on the right is also interesting because that is one of the plants that is most adept at colonizing disturbed areas. So you can see it here, looking towards downtown Pullman, growing on a compacted gravel surface between a trail and the street. A little bit later on, or I suppose these don't all bloom at the same time, rather. These are some of the DYCs, although they're rather prettier than that. These are the not quite sunflowers that you'll find on the prairie. On the left is balsam root, which is blooming right now. It's the earliest of them. And then the other three, the Helianthella, which is a perennial sunflower relative, Arnica sororia, and Wyathia amplexicalis, or mule's ears, those will all bloom towards midsummer. And they can be absolutely spectacular. So this is after most of the Palouse prairie has finished blooming. These perennial sunflowers will come through and just turn the entire place yellow. This is the north slope of Kamiak Butte in the middle of July. This is a little cutie that I had to throw in. So on the right, I was so excited to find this plant while going up one of the peaks of Moscow Mountain, just east of Pullman here last year. And I was so excited to find this clustered broom rape in the yellow form, which is Aphelon franciscanum. And I was so excited to find this little patch of it right on top of the mountain that I'd worked so hard to get to. And then a couple of weeks later, I was walking one of the parks just near my house here, and there are large patches of it on the left, parasitizing Eriogonum heracleoides, this buckwheat that it's growing through. There are probably 1,000 or more flowers in each patch of buckwheat, which I had completely missed last year. So I'm looking forward to seeing that this year, this large groves of parasitic plants turning the hillsides of Pullman yellow. These are a few more plants that you'll see blooming in a few weeks here. There's, of course, the native form of yarrow, which has very narrow and fuzzy leaves. There's prairie smoke, Geum triflorum, which forms large patches. It has these flowers that never quite open. These are the sepals here that you can see that they're staying closed. The petals are just barely poking out the tip. And then come midsummer into autumn, they will open up into these large fuzzy seed pods. Then we have Valeriana edulis, which here is very small, but can get a few feet tall. It's one of our native valerians. It's the one that you find here on the Palouse Prairie, although there are other species in other meadows that are just upslope in the mountains. And on the right is evidently my only photo of our native geranium out here, which in its prime forms 3 foot wide, 3 foot diameter globes of pink. But this is what you get from me tonight. Also out here, you'll find common camas. This is our only species of camas in this part of the world. Here it is growing in a small remnant just above downtown Pullman. But it's interesting that you'll find common camas in places that you wouldn't expect. So in certain hollows between the hills outside of Moscow, Idaho, you will see fields and fields of camas growing through wheat fields because when they disc the fields for wheat, it doesn't get deep enough to disturb the bulbs. So there are these ancient fields of camas that are coming up through newly planted wheat. A few more plants from the prairie here. On the left is another one of my favorites. This is sometimes called golden banner or golden lupin. It's our local species of thermopsis, which gets about knee-high, sometimes waist-high. And it's a very cheery little pea flower. I haven't seen it around Pullman yet, but you do find it in town in Moscow. It's fairly widely distributed in the Northern Rockies in meadow systems, so I expect to find it out here soon. In the middle is our Palouse thistle, which extends a little bit farther into the basin and in a few other directions from the Palouse. But it's a large native thistle that likes relatively moist areas. There's a large population right near my house growing on a north slope, which is just barely poking above the surface of the soil. And then another species that you'll find scattered throughout the prairie is Cerastes marvensi, or our native field chickweed, which in some places can gild the hillsides in silver. Then as we get towards the end of the season, we have a few real treasures pop up. On the left, there's Spalding's catchfly, which is a native species of Silene, which is extremely rare. It's been found in several more places now, but it still occurs in very low population numbers and is of immediate conservation concern and is actively managed by a number of different groups. And on the right is Calochortus natatus, which is found primarily on the Palouse Prairie and extending a little bit into Idaho. And it apparently used to be rather common in this area, but it's down to at most a handful of sites and on the Palouse. And then some of the last flowers to bloom on the Palouse. On the left, we have our aster, which is found nowhere else in the world. This great big aster, which is distinguished by its extremely fuzzy foliage, especially these bracts there. And on the right is a gentian. And I must confess, I cheat a little bit. This is a photo not from the Palouse Prairie, but from those fossil lakes where this gentian gets even larger. So this plant is probably 4 feet tall. Jessica's aster gets about the same height. And I wanted to finish off by showing you a little bit of the habitat views of this Palouse Prairie. So this is the same patch just south of downtown Pullman. So here it is in early May of last year. I think last year, could have been a year prior. And you'll notice here, there's not a whole lot of grass coming through, and most of what grass there is non-native weed grass that has invaded this prairie. Most of this are these perennials. There's a little bit of a shrub there. There's some snowberry there, but here's that Cynthurus rubra that I talked about. Here is a paintbrush that's found almost exclusively on the Palouse Prairie. There's a groundsel up here, which really enjoys wet sites. There's a little bit of some seedlings of balsam root. We've got irises. We've got 2 different kinds of cinquefoils. There's the geranium coming up. There's a huge patch of the prairie smoke there. Almost all of this view is composed of perennials. Then a little bit later, and from a different angle, this patch, looking at the dry side of this patch rather, we have a totally different suite of flora. We have all of this Lomatium here, and earlier in the year there's another species of Lomatium that grows here. A little bit later there'll be onions. You can kind of see a huge field of delphinium that is running across this hillside, and then some balsam roots still blooming up there, in addition to the choke cherries on the side of the hill. Here's a view even later. This is a little bit past peak bloom, but still you can see all of these perennials coming through the weedy grass. So we have a ton of that geranium. We have some checker mallows here. There's yarrow, there's lupins, and there's that clematis that I love so much. This is also the same patch of prairie. So if ever you think that the Palouse Prairie has enough conservation on it, there's still a lot more to be done. And because I figured I had time tonight, I would go through and photograph it once more. So this is the prairie, that same prairie patch tonight. It's still a little bit early. There are a few flowers, but it still hasn't hit peak bloom. That'll happen in about 2 weeks. And you can still see that for sale sign on the right. So if you want to get involved or learn more about the Palouse Prairie, I suggest looking at a few of the conservation organizations. So we have the Palouse Clearwater Environmental Institute, the Palouse Prairie Foundation, and the Palouse Conservation District. If you want to learn more about Indigenous peoples, one of the best places to do that is at the Nez Perce National Historical Park, which is scattered all around, but it has its main visitor center at Spalding, Idaho, just outside of Lewiston, where you can really dive deeply into the history and culture of the Indigenous peoples here. If you want to learn about the agricultural history of the Palouse, and especially how it has impacted the environment here, I cannot do better than recommend Plowed Under by Andrew Duffin. And if you want to get involved or contact us here at the University or the Washington State University Herbarium, I've included our web address there as well. So with that, thank you very much, and I will be happy to take questions.
Alex, thank you. That was wonderful. And the audience agrees that it was wonderful. So at this point, we have 3 questions, so I shall begin. Sarah Walker asks, is steptoe the same as nut attack?
No, so a nut attack is used when the sort of the island of mountain is encased by ice or surrounded by ice. And it's sometimes used when we talk about the historical downstream effects of that, when we had a mountain that was previously surrounded by ice or an otherwise uninhabitable area. So steptoe is specifically where the prior geological formation is covered by a more recent geological rock surface.
Okay, Walter Furtick comments, greasebush has very oily wood and stems, and they make a good fire starter if you don't have a lot of kindling.
Excellent. Well, I'm not sure I'd use our populations out here. I always was thinking I would get it confused with Sarcobatus, the other greasebush.
William Hinckley asks, I wonder about resources for ideas on Walla Walla area native plantings, in particular along a creek bed.
So Walla Walla is a little bit different, and I don't know it as well. It has a lot in common with our area here because because you also get some of that rainfall that is dropped against the Blue Mountain front, and you have some deep soil as we do here as well. There is a little bit of a difference. So where we have almost entirely hawthorn dominated streamside woodlands, yours will sometimes have more 9-bark bushes in particular. And there are other meadow species. So you have a different species of clover than we have here. But in general, a large portion of the main plants, so the cow parsnips, the water leaves, those should be relatively similar.
Okay, you have comments that it's been fascinating and wonderful presentation. I can't imagine why, because it was. Alex, thank you. It's so good to learn about the plants of Eastern Washington and Idaho. That's from Julie O'Donnell, one of my committee members. And Peg wants to know if you'd be willing to share your contact information if we want to contact you.
Yes, I neglected to do that. I'm not sure what the best way to do that is at this point. So if you contact someone,
you can put it in the chat.
I can do that. That would make much sense. So I will type my email in the chat if you would like to get in contact with me.
Okay. And then
there you go.
Paul Schlichter asks, no, he said, thank you. He said it was a great presentation. The screen keeps moving. So Dan Dunphy, he said, how are pollinators faring out there on the Palouse? Good question.
I don't have any data on that. There are people who are working on that who I do not have not had data from. So I can only say in very general terms, There appear to be some pollinators that are, or I guess from the plant end, some plants are still buzzing with pollinators. Like violets are still buzzing with pollinators. Lomatiums are still buzzing with pollinators. Some things, though, like the clematis, I don't see that many pollinators on. By and large, there seems to be more insect activity in the canyon than there is up here in the Palouse. And I'm not sure whether that is from agricultural spraying or from what cause.
Okay, so Denise Frechette, I hope I pronounced your name almost close to what it is. Denise, I'm sorry if I didn't. Thank you. We learned so much. Yes. Alex, I knew this would be great. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you for goading me into this, Gail.
You told me to nag, so I did. So you did a great job because there are only 3 questions or comments. So well done, Alex. Thank you for putting a beautiful exclamation mark on Native Plant Appreciation Month with this great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening. And Michael Scuderi says, bravo.
Thank you, Alex. That was wonderful. I look forward to posting this recording along with the others on our website.